They tried again to demand from me. France demanded access to Burkina Faso's oil data, every survey, location, and secret beneath our soil. I gave them maps with no roads. The former colonial power, the nation that extracted our resources for over a century, the country that still believed Burkina Faso owed them something, the government that thought independence was negotiable. They demanded access to our oil data, complete geological surveys, drilling locations, reserve estimates, production forecasts, everything we'd discovered, everything we'd mapped, everything that belonged to us. Let me tell you exactly what happened, because this isn't diplomatic courtesy. This isn't international cooperation. This is documented defiance. We have the recordings. We have the correspondence. We have their demands. We have my response. We have everything. It started few weeks ago, after we completed the most comprehensive geological survey in Burkina Faso's history, after we discovered oil reserves that changed everything, after we found deposits that could transform our economy from aid-dependent to energy exporting, after we located resources that made us strategically valuable instead of strategically irrelevant. 17 billion barrels, that's what we found. 17 billion barrels of crude oil beneath Burkina soil. Enough to supply our domestic needs for 2 centuries. Enough to export significant quantities. Enough to generate revenue that could fund infrastructure, education, healthcare, industrialization. Enough to change Burkina Faso's future completely. We didn't announce it immediately. We didn't rush to inform the international community. We didn't seek Western validation or approval. We kept it quiet, conducted additional surveys, verified the findings, confirmed the estimates, made sure we understood exactly what we had before anyone else knew we had it. Because once you announce oil discovery, the vultures arrive. The corporations, the governments, the investors, everyone who wants access, everyone who demands participation, everyone who thinks African resources should be available to Western interests. We spent 3 months preparing, building legal frameworks, establishing regulatory structures, creating state-owned petroleum companies, developing extraction plans, negotiating partnerships with non-Western nations, ensuring that when we announced the discovery, we already controlled how it would be developed. Then we made the announcement. Simple, direct, clear. Burkina Faso has discovered significant oil reserves. All extraction will be managed by state-owned enterprises. All partnerships will be determined by the government. All revenue will serve Burkina development priorities. The reaction was immediate, predictable, aggressive. Within hours, French petroleum companies were calling, Total, Marl and Prom, Perenco, all of them demanding meetings, all of them insisting on access, all of them acting like Burkina Faso's oil was somehow their entitlement. Within days, the French government was involved. The Foreign Ministry, the Ministry of Economy, the Presidential Palace, all of them applying pressure, all of them demanding information, all of them treating our discovery like it required their approval. The French ambassador requested an urgent meeting. I made him wait 5 days, not to be petty, but to establish a principle. When you demand instead of request, you wait. When you treat us like subordinates instead of equals, you learn patience. When you act entitled instead of respectful, you get reminded that we're sovereign. When he finally arrived, he came with a delegation, petroleum experts, economic advisors, legal specialists, all of them carrying briefcases full of documents, all of them prepared to explain why France needed access to our oil data, all of them ready to present the case for why Burkina Faso should share geological information with French corporations. I met him alone. No delegation, no advisors visible, no technical experts, just me. Because this wasn't a technical discussion. This wasn't an economic negotiation. This was a conversation about sovereignty. And sovereignty doesn't require expert consultation. The ambassador started with formality. That's always how they start, with diplomatic protocol and carefully constructed courtesy. He said, "Mr. President, thank you for receiving us. France congratulates Burkina Faso on this significant oil discovery. This is an important moment for your nation's development." I said nothing, just waited. He continued, "As you know, France has extensive experience in petroleum development. Our companies have operated in Africa for decades. We have the technology, the expertise, the capital to help Burkina Faso maximize the value of these resources. I said, help us or help yourselves? He paused, recalculated. Both, Mr. President. Partnership benefits everyone. French investment would accelerate development. French technology would optimize extraction. French expertise would ensure environmental standards. French capital would fund infrastructure. I said, and French control would ensure French interests are served first. He shifted approach. Less charm, more directness. Mr. President, we're not asking for control. We're requesting access to geological data, survey results, reserve estimates, drilling analysis, information that would allow French companies to submit competitive bids for development contracts. I said, why? He looked confused. Why what? I said, why should we share that information with French companies? Why should we provide geological data to corporations that will use it to extract maximum value for themselves? Why should we hand over survey results that took us 3 years and significant resources to compile? He said, because transparency attracts investment, because data sharing is standard practice, because international petroleum development requires cooperation between host governments and experienced corporations. I said, standard practice according to whom, cooperation defined by whom, requirements established by whom? Because from where I'm sitting, these standards and requirements and practices all seem designed to benefit Western corporations at African expense. He leaned forward. Mr. President, I understand your skepticism. France's history in Africa is complicated, but this is different. This is about mutual benefit. This is about partnership that serves both our interests. I said, Ambassador, let me tell you about France's partnership with Africa. For 60 years after formal independence, French companies extracted African oil at prices that barely compensated host nations. For 6 decades, French corporations used African resources to fuel French prosperity, while African people remained poor. For generations, France structured partnerships that guaranteed French benefit regardless of African cost. I said, so, no, I don't believe this is different. I don't trust that this is about mutual benefit. I don't accept that France's sudden interest in Burkina Faso oil is motivated by concern for our development. His expression hardened. The diplomatic courtesy disappeared. Now I was seeing the real position, the actual demand beneath the polite request. He said, Mr. President, France has legitimate interests in West African petroleum development. We have existing infrastructure. We have regional relationships. We have strategic considerations. Burkina Faso's oil doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in a region where France has been present for over a century. I said, present? Is that what we're calling colonialism now? Presence? He said, I'm talking about current reality, not historical grievances. France operates refineries in Côte d'Ivoire. We have pipelines through several West African nations. We have distribution networks across the region. Burkina Faso oil could integrate into existing French infrastructure. That integration requires data sharing. I said, so you're saying Burkina Faso should share our geological data because it would be convenient for French infrastructure? We should provide our survey results because it would benefit French regional operations? We should hand over information we paid to compile because France has pipelines nearby? He said, I'm saying cooperation serves everyone's interests. I'm saying integration into existing systems is more efficient than building new systems. I'm saying partnership with experienced operators is smarter than attempting independent development. I leaned back, studied him. Let the silence extend. Let him wonder what I was thinking. Let him feel the discomfort of not controlling the conversation. Then I said, Ambassador, I'm going to give you what you asked for. I'm going to provide the information France requested. I'm going to share data about Burkina Faso oil resources. His face brightened. Relief, satisfaction. The assumption that pressure had worked, that demands had succeeded, that Burkina Faso had bent to French expectations. I opened a drawer, pulled out a document, placed it on the desk between us, slid it toward him. I said, this is a map of Burkina Faso. It shows our borders, our major cities, our geographic features, and as you can see, it has no roads. He looked at the map, confused. Mr. President, I don't understand. We requested geological data, oil reserve information, survey results. This is just a basic map with no infrastructure marked. I said, exactly, a map with no roads, because that's the level of access France will have to Burkina Faso oil data. None, zero. The same amount of detail this map provides about our infrastructure is the same amount of information France will receive about our petroleum resources. The silence was absolute, complete, total. He just stared at the map, then at me, then back at the map, processing, understanding, realizing that I hadn't capitulated. I'd refused. Definitively. Symbolically. Permanently. He said, "Mr. President, this is unacceptable. France has legitimate expectations. We have historical relationships. We have regional interests. We have strategic considerations that require access to this information." I said, "France has no legitimate expectations about Burkina Faso resources. You have historical exploitation, not historical relationships. You have colonial interests, not regional interests. You have strategic desires, not strategic rights." I said, "Burkina Faso's oil belongs to Burkina Faso. Our geological data is our property. Our survey results are our information. Our reserve estimates are our knowledge. And we will share it with whom we choose, on terms we determine, for purposes we approve." I said, "And we choose not to share it with France. We determine that French corporations will not receive this data. We approve partnerships with nations that respect our sovereignty instead of demanding our submission." He stood up, anger replacing diplomatic courtesy. "Mr. President, you're making a serious mistake. France is a major investor in West Africa. We provide significant aid to Burkina Faso. We have military cooperation agreements. We have economic partnerships. Refusing to cooperate on petroleum development will have consequences." I stood up too, looked him directly in the eye. "Is that a threat, Ambassador?" He said, "It's a reality. It's a recognition that decisions have implications. It's an acknowledgement that relationships are reciprocal. If Burkina Faso refuses French partnership, France will reconsider Burkina Faso partnerships." I said, "Reconsider whatever you want, cut whatever aid you want, terminate whatever agreements you want, because 3 months ago, NATO tried to assassinate me with a drone strike. They failed. I survived, and I learned something important." I said, "I learned that once they've tried to kill you, their other threats become meaningless. Once they've attempted assassination, aid cuts are irrelevant. Once they've fired missiles at your convoy, diplomatic pressure is laughable." I said, "So threaten me with whatever you want, because you've already shown me you're willing to kill African leaders who demand respect. And once you know someone is willing to kill you, nothing else they threaten matters." I picked up the map, held it toward him. "Take this with you. Show it to your petroleum companies. Show it to your government. Show it to anyone in France who thinks Burkina Faso oil data should be available to French corporations. Show them a map with no roads, and explain that this is the level of access France will have to our resources." He took the map, hands shaking slightly, anger and shock and disbelief mixing in his expression. He'd come expecting cooperation. He'd anticipated negotiation. He'd assumed that pressure would work because pressure had always worked before. But I wasn't every African leader before. I wasn't someone who bent to French demands. I wasn't a president who prioritized French approval over Burkina Faso sovereignty. The delegation left, no handshakes, no diplomatic pleasantries, no pretense of continued good relations, just the cold reality that France had demanded access and been denied, definitively, symbolically. With a map that had no roads. Within hours, the French government responded, not diplomatically, not through proper channels, but publicly, aggressively, punitively. France suspended all development aid to Burkina Faso, froze cooperation agreements, recalled technical advisors, terminated training programs, everything, immediately, without negotiation, without transition periods, without concern for projects that would be abandoned or programs that would collapse. The message was clear. Defy France and suffer consequences. Refuse French demands and face punishment. Choose sovereignty over submission and experience isolation. But something unexpected happened. Something France didn't anticipate. Something that turned their punishment into our opportunity. Within 24 hours, China called. Offered to replace all suspended French aid. Doubled it. Provided additional petroleum development assistance. Committed technical experts. Promised infrastructure investment. All without demanding geological data. All without requiring information sharing. All without treating Burkina Faso oil as Chinese entitlement. Russia called next. Offered petroleum extraction technology. provided refinery construction expertise, committed to pipeline development, guaranteed market access for Burkinabe crude. All on terms that respected our sovereignty, all through partnerships that recognized our control, all with agreements that ensured Burkinabe benefit. Turkey called, India called, Iran called, United Arab Emirates called. One by one, nations that France had spent decades trying to exclude from West Africa reached out, offered partnership, provided alternatives, demonstrated that French aid wasn't irreplaceable, that French cooperation wasn't essential, that French participation wasn't necessary. Within 1 week, we had replaced all French aid with alternative partnerships. Within 2 weeks, we had secured better terms than France had ever offered. Within 3 weeks, we had established petroleum development agreements that guaranteed Burkinabe control, Burkinabe ownership, Burkinabe benefit. France's punishment had backfired, spectacularly, completely, irreversibly. Because they'd assumed we had no alternatives. They'd believed we needed them more than they needed us. They'd thought French aid was irreplaceable and French cooperation was essential. They'd calculated that threatening to withdraw would force compliance. They were wrong about everything. We didn't need French aid. We needed fair partnerships. We didn't need French cooperation. We needed respectful relationships. We didn't need French participation. We needed sovereign control of our resources. And we found all of that with partners who didn't demand our geological data, who didn't treat our oil as their entitlement, who didn't punish us for refusing to submit. The French ambassador requested another meeting 2 weeks after the aid suspension. I made him wait 3 weeks, because when you punish us for demanding respect, you learn patience. When you withdraw aid to force compliance, you wait while we secure alternatives. When you try to isolate us, you discover we're not alone. When he finally arrived, he came without a delegation. No petroleum experts, no economic advisors, no legal specialists, just him. Because he understood this wasn't about technical details anymore. This was about whether France would accept Burkinabe sovereignty or continue demanding Burkinabe submission. He started differently this time. Less formality, less diplomatic courtesy, more directness, more recognition that his previous approach had failed completely. He said, "Mr. President, France may have overreacted. The aid suspension was perhaps premature. The withdrawal of cooperation was possibly excessive. We're prepared to reconsider those decisions." I said nothing, just waited. He continued, "But we need something in return. We need some level of access to petroleum data, not complete access, not full geological surveys, but enough information to allow French companies to participate in development bidding. Enough data to enable competitive proposals." I said, "Why would we provide that? Why would we share information with French companies after France tried to punish us for refusing to share information with French companies? Why would we reward French threats with French access?" He said, "Because partnership is better than confrontation, because cooperation serves both our interests. Because France and Burkina Faso have a long history that shouldn't be destroyed over one disagreement." I said, "A long history of what? French extraction of Burkinabe resources? French exploitation of Burkinabe labor? French control of Burkinabe economy? That's the history you want to preserve?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. President, I acknowledge that France's historical relationship with Africa is complicated, but we're talking about the future, not the past. We're discussing partnership going forward, not exploitation that happened decades ago." I said, "The past shapes the present. History informs current decisions. What France did for centuries determines how we respond today. You can't separate past exploitation from present demands. You can't ignore historical extraction when requesting current access. You can't pretend colonialism is irrelevant when discussing petroleum partnerships." I leaned forward. "Let me explain something to you, Ambassador. That map I gave you, the map with no roads, that wasn't just a symbolic gesture. That was a statement of principle, a declaration of sovereignty, a demonstration that Burkina Faso will share information with partners we choose, not with powers who demand it." I said, "France demanded access. We denied it. France punished us. We found alternatives. France now wants to reconsider. We're not interested. That's the sequence. That's the reality. That's the new relationship between France and Burkina Faso." He said, "Mr. President, surely there's some accommodation we can reach, some compromise that serves both our interests, some arrangement that allows French participation without compromising Burkinabe sovereignty. I said, you want accommodation? Here's the accommodation. France can participate in Burkinabe petroleum development under the same terms as every other interested party. Public bidding, transparent evaluation, competitive proposals, no preferential access, no special consideration, no historical privileges, just equal treatment with everyone else. I said, and those bids will be evaluated based on what they offer Burkina Faso: technology transfer, job creation, infrastructure development, revenue sharing, environmental protection, everything that benefits our nation, not what they offer France, not what they provide French corporations, not what they guarantee French interests. I said, if French companies can compete on those terms, if they can offer better value than Chinese companies or Russian companies or Turkish companies, if they can provide more benefit to Burkina Faso than alternative partners, then yes, they can participate. But they'll participate as contractors, as service providers, as partners who work for us, not as corporations who expect us to work for them. He said, and the geological data, the survey results, the reserve estimates? I said, will be provided to winning bidders after contracts are signed, not before. Not to enable competitive proposals, not to allow companies to calculate maximum extraction at minimum cost. But after partnerships are established, after terms are agreed, after commitments are made. I said, because that data is valuable, it cost us significant resources to compile, it represents years of work, it contains information that gives us leverage, and we're not handing it over for free just because France thinks they're entitled to it. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, this is a fundamental change in how France and Burkina Faso relate to each other. I said, yes, it is. Because the old relationship was based on French demands and Burkinabe compliance. The new relationship is based on mutual respect and equal partnership. The old model was French entitlement and Burkinabe submission. The new model is competitive bidding and sovereign control. I said, if France can accept that, if French corporations can compete on equal terms, if French government can respect Burkinabe sovereignty, then yes, we can have a relationship. But it will be a different relationship, a respectful relationship, an equal relationship, not the colonial relationship France is comfortable with. He stood up, extended his hand. I'll communicate your position to Paris. I'll explain the new terms. I'll recommend that France adapt to this new reality. I shook his hand. Communicate whatever you want. Explain whatever you need to explain. Recommend whatever you think is appropriate. But understand that we're not waiting for French approval. We're not seeking French acceptance. We're not requiring French participation. We're moving forward with or without France. That's sovereignty. That's independence. That's what it means to control your own resources. He left, took the map with no roads, returned to France with the news that Burkina Faso would not bend to French demands, that Burkinabe oil would not be available on French terms, that the era of French entitlement to African resources was over. The French government's response was instructive. They didn't apologize. They didn't acknowledge overreach. They didn't admit that demanding geological data was inappropriate. They just quietly adjusted their approach. French petroleum companies submitted bids for Burkinabe development contracts, competitive bids, detailed proposals, offers that included technology transfer, job creation, infrastructure development, everything we'd specified, everything we'd required, everything that demonstrated they understood the new reality. But their bids weren't the best. Chinese companies offered better technology transfer, Russian companies provided better revenue sharing, Turkish companies committed to more infrastructure development, UAE companies guaranteed better environmental protection. We awarded contracts to the partners who offered the most benefit to Burkina Faso, not to the partners with the longest history in West Africa, not to the corporations with the most regional infrastructure, not to the companies whose home governments had colonized us, but to the partners who respected our sovereignty and served our interests. France received nothing. No contracts. No access. No participation. Not because we excluded them vindictively, but because they couldn't compete. Because their bids weren't good enough. Because other partners offered more value. And that's the real consequence of demanding instead of requesting. That's the actual cost of treating African nations as subordinates instead of equals. That's the genuine price of assuming entitlement instead of earning partnership. You lose. You get excluded. You watch as others build relationships you could have had if you'd shown respect. You observe as alternative partners secure access you assumed was yours. You witness as African resources develop without you because you couldn't accept African sovereignty. The French foreign minister called me directly 3 months later, not the ambassador, not a diplomatic envoy, the foreign minister himself, because France was starting to understand what they'd lost, starting to recognize that Burkina Faso oil would develop without French participation, starting to realize that their historical presence in West Africa didn't guarantee future access. He said, "President Traoré, I'm calling to see if there's any possibility of French involvement in Burkina Faso petroleum development, any opportunity for our companies to participate, any chance for France to be part of this important project." I said, "Minister, I appreciate the call, but as I explained to your ambassador, French companies had the opportunity to bid competitively. They submitted proposals. We evaluated them fairly. Other partners offered better terms. That's the reality. That's the outcome. That's the result of competitive bidding." He said, "But surely there are additional contracts, additional opportunities, additional phases of development where French expertise could be valuable." I said, "There may be, in the future, if French companies can compete, if they can offer value that exceeds alternatives, if they can demonstrate that French partnership serves Burkina Faso interests better than other partnerships. But there are no reserved contracts, no guaranteed access, no special consideration for historical presence." He said, "President Traoré, I want to be direct. France made mistakes in how we approached this. We were too demanding, too presumptuous, too confident that our historical relationship entitled us to preferential treatment. We were wrong, and we're prepared to acknowledge that." I said, "I appreciate the acknowledgement, but acknowledgement doesn't change outcomes. Recognition of mistakes doesn't reverse decisions. Admitting error doesn't create opportunities that no longer exist." I said, "French companies had their chance. They bid, they lost. Other partners won. Those contracts are signed. Those relationships are established. Those partnerships are proceeding. France's opportunity has passed. Not because we excluded you, but because you couldn't compete." He was silent for a moment. Then, "What would it take for France to have another opportunity? What would French companies need to offer? What would France need to commit to?" I said, "Respect. Genuine respect. Not diplomatic courtesy. Not polite formality. But actual recognition that Burkina Faso is a sovereign nation that controls its own resources on its own terms. That our geological data is our property. That our oil belongs to us. That partnerships happen on our terms, not on French demands." I said, "If France can demonstrate that respect, if French companies can compete without expecting preferential treatment, if French government can engage without demanding submission, then yes, there may be future opportunities, but they'll be earned, not granted, not assumed, not demanded, earned through competitive proposals that serve Burkina Faso interests." He said, "I understand, completely, and I'll communicate that to French companies. I'll explain the new reality. I'll ensure that future French engagement with Burkina Faso reflects the respect you're demanding." I said, "I'm not demanding respect, Minister. I'm requiring it. Demanding implies I'm asking for something exceptional. Requiring recognizes it's the baseline, the minimum, the standard that should have always existed but never did because France treated African nations as subordinates instead of equals." The call ended. Politely, professionally, but with absolute clarity that France's historical presence in West Africa no longer guaranteed French access to West African resources, that colonial relationships were dead, that the era of French entitlement was over, that African sovereignty was real, permanent, non-negotiable. But let me tell you what happened next, because this is where the story becomes bigger than just France and Burkina Faso. This is where one map with no roads becomes a continental statement. This is where one nation's refusal to share geological data becomes a movement of African resource sovereignty. Within 2 weeks of France's aid suspension and our successful replacement of that aid with alternative partnerships, I received calls from 7 other African leaders, presidents, prime ministers, heads of state who controlled valuable resources and faced similar French demands. President Sassou Nguesso of Congo-Brazzaville called. He said, "Brother Traoré, France has been demanding access to our oil data for years. We've been providing it because we thought we had no choice. We thought French aid was irreplaceable. We thought French cooperation was essential. But you've shown us something different. You've demonstrated that alternatives exist, that French demands can be refused, that African sovereignty over African resources is achievable. He said, I'm going to do what you did. I'm going to refuse French demands for geological data. I'm going to control Congolese information about Congolese resources. And if France suspends aid, I'll replace it with alternative partnerships, because you've proven it's possible. President Touadéra of Central African Republic called. He said, France has been pressuring us to share mineral survey data, gold, diamonds, uranium, everything we've discovered, everything we've mapped. They act like our geological information is their entitlement, like our resources require their approval to develop. He said, I'm sending them a map with no roads, the same symbolic gesture you used, the same statement of sovereignty, the same refusal to submit to French demands. Because you've shown us how. You've demonstrated that it works. You've proven that African nations can control African data about African resources. One by one, African leaders called, shared their experiences with French demands, described their frustration with French entitlement, expressed their determination to follow Burkina Faso's example, committed to refusing data sharing that served French interests at African expense. Within 3 months, 14 African nations had refused French demands for geological data. 14 governments had asserted sovereignty over resource information. 14 countries had sent France maps with no roads or equivalent symbolic gestures that communicated the same message. African data about African resources belongs to African nations. France panicked. Because suddenly, this wasn't about one difficult president in Burkina Faso. This was about a continental movement. This was about African nations collectively refusing French entitlement. This was about the end of French privileged access to African geological information. French petroleum companies found themselves competing for African contracts without the data they'd always assumed would be provided. French mining corporations discovered they couldn't calculate extraction costs without geological surveys they'd always been given. French government realized their historical presence in Africa no longer guaranteed preferential treatment. The French president called me, not through diplomatic channels, not through intermediaries, directly. Because France was starting to understand that what I'd started in Burkina Faso was spreading across the continent. That one map with no roads had become a symbol. That one refusal had become a movement. He said, President Traoré, I want to discuss the current situation. France values its relationship with Africa. We want to continue being a partner in African development. But this movement you've started, this refusal to share geological data, it's making partnership difficult. It's complicating cooperation. It's threatening relationships that have existed for decades. I said, Mr. President, with respect, those relationships existed for decades because African nations had no alternatives, because we believed French aid was irreplaceable, because we thought French cooperation was essential, because we accepted French demands because we saw no other option. I said, but that's changed. Alternatives exist. Other partners are available. Different relationships are possible. African nations no longer need to accept French terms because French terms are no longer the only terms. He said, but surely some level of information sharing is necessary. Surely geological data can be exchanged in ways that serve both our interests. Surely there's a middle ground between complete transparency and complete secrecy. I said, the middle ground is competitive bidding, equal treatment, no preferential access. French companies compete with everyone else. If they win contracts, they receive data necessary to fulfill those contracts. If they don't win contracts, they receive nothing. That's the middle ground. That's the fair arrangement. That's the respectful partnership. He said, that's a fundamental change from how France and Africa have historically related. I said, yes, it is, because the historical relationship was based on colonial power dynamics. The new relationship is based on sovereign equality. The old model was French demands and African compliance. The new model is competitive partnerships and mutual respect. I said, if France can accept that, if French companies can compete on equal terms, if French government can respect African sovereignty, then yes, partnership is possible. But it will be a different partnership, an equal partnership, a respectful partnership, not the colonial partnership France is comfortable with. He was silent. Then, you understand that France will adapt to this new reality, that French companies will learn to compete without preferential data access, that French government will adjust to African sovereignty. But it will take time, it will require change, it will demand that both France and Africa approach partnership differently. I said, take all the time you need, make whatever changes are necessary, adjust however you must, but understand that African nations aren't waiting. We're developing our resources with partners who respect our sovereignty now. We're building relationships with corporations that compete fairly now. We're creating partnerships based on mutual benefit now. I said, so adapt quickly, because every day France spends adjusting is a day other partners are securing contracts. Every week France takes to change is a weak alternative. Relationships are deepening. Every month France needs to accept new realities is a month African resources are developing without French participation. The call ended. The French president understood. France would need to change. French companies would need to compete. French government would need to respect African sovereignty. Or France would watch as African resources developed without French involvement. That conversation was 4 months ago. Since then, France has slowly, reluctantly, painfully adjusted. French petroleum companies now submit competitive bids without expecting preferential data access. French mining corporations now propose partnerships that emphasize African benefit. French government now engages with African nations with more respect and less entitlement. They're learning, slowly, gradually, incompletely. But they're learning that the era of French privileged access to African resources is over. That African geological data belongs to African nations. That African sovereignty is real and permanent and non-negotiable. And the map with no roads has become a symbol, a continental symbol, a representation of African refusal to provide information that serves Western extraction at African expense. A statement that African data about African resources will be controlled by African nations. I've received dozens of maps from other African leaders, maps with no roads, maps with no infrastructure, maps with no detail beyond basic geography. All of them sent to France or other former colonial powers, all of them communicating the same message. You demanded access. We refused. This is the level of information you'll receive. None. Some are creative. President Ouattara of Côte d'Ivoire sent France a map that showed only the Atlantic Ocean coastline. No interior details, no cities, no features, just coastline. The message, you can see where we border the ocean, everything else is none of your business. I was in a private meeting with President Ouattara when he showed me his map. We were in Abidjan, discussing regional cooperation on resource sovereignty. He pulled out this beautifully printed document. Official government letterhead, presidential seal, everything formal and proper. And on it, just a thin line representing where Côte d'Ivoire meets the Atlantic Ocean. He said, Brother Traoré, when you sent France that map with no roads, you gave me an idea, but I wanted to make it even more pointed, even more symbolic, even more insulting to their presumption. He explained his thinking. France has been demanding access to our offshore oil data for 2 years. They claim they need it for regional energy planning. They say it's necessary for West African petroleum coordination. They insist it's required for maritime boundary agreements. He said, but I know what they really want. They want to know exactly where our oil is so French companies can calculate extraction costs before bidding. They want our geological surveys so they can undercut competitors who don't have that information. They want our data so they can maintain the advantage they've always had through privileged access to African information. He said, so I gave them the coastline, just the coastline, the part they can see from satellite imagery, the part that's already public knowledge. The part that tells them absolutely nothing about what lies beneath our territorial waters. He said, and I included a note, very polite, very diplomatic. It said, please find attached the requested maritime information for the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire. We trust this satisfies your requirements for regional coordination. Nothing more, nothing less, just enough courtesy to make the insult undeniable. The French response was furious. They called it uncooperative. They said it demonstrated Côte d'Ivoire's lack of commitment to regional partnership. They warned about consequences for bilateral relations. They threatened to reconsider development assistance. President Ouattara told me he'd received a call from the French foreign minister within 48 hours. The minister was angry, barely containing his frustration, demanding to know why Côte d'Ivoire was being deliberately obstructive. President Ouattara said he'd responded calmly, "Minister, you asked for maritime information. We provided maritime information. You can see our coastline. You can see where we border the Atlantic Ocean. If you wanted more specific data, perhaps you should have been more specific in your request." The French minister said, "You know exactly what we need. We need offshore geological surveys. We need seismic data. We need reserve estimates. We need information that allows proper evaluation of Ivorian petroleum resources." President Ouattara said, "Why do you need that information, Minister? Côte d'Ivoire will conduct competitive bidding for offshore development. French companies are welcome to participate. They'll receive necessary data after winning contracts, not before." The minister said, "That's not how petroleum development works. Companies need data to submit competitive bids. They need geological information to calculate costs and risks. They need survey results to propose development plans." President Ouattara said, "That's how petroleum development worked when African nations were weak and desperate, when we had no alternatives and needed any investment we could attract, when we believed Western companies were doing us a favor by extracting our resources. But that era is over." He told the minister, "Côte d'Ivoire spent $23 million conducting offshore geological surveys. We invested significant resources. We employed experts. We compiled comprehensive data. That data is valuable. That data is our property. That data will not be provided for free to foreign corporations so they can calculate how to extract maximum value at minimum cost." He said, "French companies want our data. They can win development contracts. They can commit to technology transfer. They can guarantee Ivorian employment. They can ensure environmental protection. They can agree to fair revenue sharing. And then, after all those commitments are legally binding, they'll receive the data necessary to fulfill their contractual obligations." The French minister tried threats, said France would reconsider its significant aid to Côte d'Ivoire, would review military cooperation agreements, would reassess economic partnerships, all the standard pressure tactics. President Ouattara told me he'd responded with something I'd taught him. He said, "Minister, 3 months ago NATO tried to assassinate President Traoré of Burkina Faso with a drone strike. They fired missiles at an African president because he demanded sovereignty. That's how far Western powers are willing to go to maintain control of African resources." He said, "So your threats about aid cuts and cooperation reviews, they're meaningless, because we know you're willing to kill us if we resist too strongly. Once you know someone is willing to murder you, their threats about aid and partnerships become irrelevant. You've already shown us your worst. Everything else is just noise." He told me the French minister had gone silent, completely silent, for almost a minute because President Ouattara had connected the dots, had made explicit what everyone knew but nobody said. That Western control of African resources is ultimately backed by violence. That when economic pressure fails, military pressure follows. That the drone strike on me wasn't an isolated incident but a revelation of how the system really works. President Déby of Chad sent France a map that showed only the Sahara Desert, no oil fields, no mineral deposits, no resource locations, just sand. The message: you can see our desert. Our resources are invisible to you. President Déby's map was even more creative than President Ouattara's. He didn't just show empty geography, he showed the most hostile, most barren, most inhospitable geography possible. The Sahara Desert, endless sand, nothing valuable, nothing useful, nothing that would interest anyone. I spoke with President Déby about his choice. He explained the symbolism. Brother Traoré, Chad has significant oil reserves. We also have gold, uranium, and other valuable minerals. France has been extracting Chadian resources for decades, but they've always acted like they're doing us a favor, like they're bringing civilization to the desert, like we should be grateful they're willing to operate in such a difficult environment." He said, "So I gave them a map of that difficult environment, just the desert, just the sand, just the hostile landscape they claim makes Chadian operations so challenging. And I included a note. Please find attached comprehensive geological information for the Republic of Chad. As you can see, we are primarily desert. We trust this addresses your information requirements." He laughed when he told me about France's reaction. They were apoplectic. They sent 3 different diplomatic communications in 1 week, each one more frustrated than the last. Each one demanding real geological data, each one threatening consequences if we didn't comply. He said, "But I held firm. I told them exactly what you told France, that Chadian geological data belongs to Chad, that we spent resources compiling it, that we won't hand it over for free to corporations that will use it against our interests, that if French companies want access to our data, they need to win development contracts first." He said something profound. "You know what your map with no roads taught me? It taught me that symbolic gestures matter. That sometimes the most powerful response isn't a detailed argument or a diplomatic negotiation. Sometimes the most powerful response is a simple gesture that communicates absolute refusal. A gesture so clear that no one can misunderstand it, a gesture so definitive that no one can negotiate around it." He said, "My map of just desert sand is that gesture. It says, you want Chadian geological data? Here's what you can see. Sand, just sand. Everything else is ours. Everything valuable is invisible to you. Everything beneath the surface belongs to us and will be shared only on our terms." President Tshisekedi of Democratic Republic of Congo sent France a map that showed only rivers, no mining sites, no mineral reserves, no geological features, just rivers. The message: you can see our waterways, our wealth beneath the ground is not for your eyes. President Tshisekedi's choice was particularly meaningful given DRC's resource wealth. The Democratic Republic of Congo possesses more mineral wealth than almost any nation on Earth: cobalt, copper, coltan, gold, diamonds, lithium, rare earth elements. Everything modern technology requires. And for over a century, foreign powers have extracted that wealth while leaving Congolese people impoverished. Belgium during colonial era, Western corporations after independence, Chinese companies more recently. Everyone taking Congolese resources while Congolese citizens remained among the poorest people on the planet. President Tshisekedi told me his map was a statement of reclamation. Brother Traoré, for too long, everyone has known more about Congolese resources than Congolese people. Foreign geologists mapped our minerals, foreign companies calculated our wealth, foreign governments planned our development, and Congolese citizens just watched as our resources enriched everyone except us. He said, "I sent France a map showing only our rivers, the Congo River, the Kasai River, the Lomami River, all the waterways they can see from space. All the geography that's already public knowledge, and nothing about what lies beneath, nothing about our cobalt deposits, nothing about our copper reserves, nothing about our coltan locations, nothing about our lithium resources." He said, "Because that information is ours now, we've reclaimed it, we've taken control of knowledge about our own resources, and we will share it only with partners who respect our sovereignty, commit to fair terms, and ensure Congolese benefit from Congolese wealth." He told me about a conversation with a French mining executive who had been operating in DRC for 30 years. The executive had called him frustrated about the new policy, said it was unprecedented, said it violated decades of cooperative practice, said it would discourage investment. President Tshisekedi said he'd responded bluntly, "Sir, you've been extracting Congolese cobalt for 30 years, you've made billions of dollars, your company has become enormously wealthy. And the Congolese people who live above the cobalt you've extracted remain desperately poor. That's your decades of cooperative practice, that's your investment, that's your partnership." He said, "So yes, we're changing the practice. We're demanding different investment. We're requiring real partnership. And if that discourages companies that profit from Congolese poverty, good. We don't want that investment. We don't need that partnership. We don't benefit from that cooperation." He told the executive, "You want continued access to Congolese cobalt? You'll compete for it. You'll bid for contracts like everyone else. You'll commit to technology transfer, Congolese employment, environmental protection, fair revenue sharing, and only after you've made those commitments legally binding will you receive geological data necessary to fulfill your contracts." He said, "Your 30 years of operation give you no special privileges. Your historical presence creates no entitlement. Your past extraction generates no future rights. You start from zero like every other bidder. And if you can't compete on fair terms, someone else will." The executive had protested, said French companies had relationships with DRC that should be valued, said historical partnerships should be respected, said decades of cooperation should count for something. President Tshisekedi said he'd ended the conversation with one sentence: "Your decades of cooperation left my people poor while making you rich. That relationship is not something I value. That partnership is not something I respect. That cooperation is not something that counts in your favor." Each map is a statement. Each refusal is a declaration. Each gesture is an assertion of sovereignty, and together they represent a continental awakening: Africa controlling African data, Africa managing African information, Africa determining who gets access to African knowledge about African resources. But these maps represent something deeper than just information control. They represent a psychological shift, a transformation in how African leaders think about sovereignty, a recognition that we don't owe explanations. We don't owe access. We don't owe anything to powers that spent centuries taking everything. President Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe sent a map showing only political borders. No cities, no infrastructure, no resources, just the outline of Zimbabwe. The message: you can see where Zimbabwe begins and ends. What happens within those borders is our business. President Museveni of Uganda sent a map showing only Lake Victoria. No oil locations, no mineral deposits, no resource data, just the lake. The message: you can see our water. Our wealth is not your concern. President Magufuli of Tanzania sent a map showing only Mount Kilimanjaro. No gold mines, no gemstone locations, no geological surveys, just the mountain. The message: you can see our highest peak. Our treasures beneath the surface are ours alone. Each leader added their own creative touch. Each map carried its own specific message. Each gesture communicated the same fundamental principle: African data about African resources belongs to Africa. And these weren't just symbolic gestures. These maps had real consequences. They changed negotiations. They shifted power dynamics. They transformed how African nations engaged with foreign corporations and foreign governments. Companies that had operated for decades assuming privileged access suddenly found themselves competing on equal terms with newcomers. Governments that had received geological data automatically suddenly had to negotiate for basic information. Powers that had treated African resources as partially theirs suddenly confronted African sovereignty made real. The psychological impact was enormous. For African leaders, these maps represented liberation. Liberation from the assumption that we owed transparency to former colonizers. Liberation from the belief that we needed to share information to attract investment. Liberation from the fear that asserting sovereignty would result in isolation. For Western powers, these maps represented loss. Loss of privileged access they'd enjoyed for generations. Loss of information advantage that had enabled exploitation. Loss of control over African resources they'd assumed would always be available on their terms. To every African leader reading this, they will demand your geological data. They will insist they need your survey results. They will claim that information sharing is necessary for development. They will argue that transparency attracts investment. They will pressure you to provide data that cost you resources to compile. Refuse them. Send them a map with no roads. Give them basic geography and nothing more. Control your information. Protect your data. Guard your knowledge. Because that information is valuable. Because that data is leverage. Because that knowledge is power. I'm not suggesting isolation. I'm not advocating refusal of all partnerships. I'm not recommending rejection of foreign investment. I'm saying that partnership should be mutual. That investment should serve African interests. That foreign participation should respect African sovereignty. And that starts with information control, with recognizing that geological data is valuable, with understanding that survey results are leverage, with knowing that resource information is power that should be guarded, protected, and shared only on terms that benefit African nations. When they demand your data, ask yourself, why do they want it? How will they use it? Who benefits from me sharing it? What do I gain from providing it? What leverage do I lose by surrendering it? Usually, the answers reveal that they want your data to calculate extraction costs. They'll use it to maximize their profit at your expense. They benefit from information asymmetry. You gain nothing from sharing it for free. You lose leverage by providing information they'll use against your interests. So refuse. Politely, firmly, definitively. Send them a map with no roads, or a map with only coastline, or a map with only desert, or a map with only rivers, or whatever creative gesture communicates that your geological data belongs to you and will be shared only on your terms. And when they suspend aid, replace it. When they withdraw cooperation, find alternatives. When they threaten consequences, build partnerships with nations that respect your sovereignty. Because alternatives exist, because other partners are available, because you don't need them as much as they've convinced you that you do. France demanded access to our oil data. I gave them a map with no roads. They suspended aid. We replaced it with better partnerships. They threatened isolation. We found eager alternatives. They assumed we would bend. We demonstrated we could stand. And now, 14 African nations have done the same. 14 governments have refused French demands. 14 countries have asserted sovereignty over geological data. 14 presidents have sent maps with no roads or equivalent symbolic gestures. But the number is growing. Every week, another African leader contacts me, asks about the map strategy, inquires about consequences, seeks advice on implementation, wants to know if it really works. And I tell them all the same thing. Yes, it works. Not because the map itself has power, but because the map represents a decision to control your information, a decision to guard your leverage, a decision to demand respect, a decision to assert sovereignty. That decision is what matters. The map is just a symbol of that decision, a visible representation of an invisible transformation. A public gesture that communicates a private commitment to never again surrender African information about African resources to foreign powers who will use it against African interests. President Kenyatta of Kenya called me last month, said he was facing pressure from British mining companies demanding geological survey data, said they were threatening to withdraw from Kenya if he didn't provide comprehensive information about mineral deposits. I asked him, "What do you want to do?" He said, "I want to refuse them. I want to send them a map with no roads like you did, but I'm afraid of the consequences. Britain provides significant aid to Kenya. British companies are major investors. British government has influence in East Africa. I'm worried about what happens if I say no." I said, "Brother, let me ask you something. If you provide that geological data, if you give British companies comprehensive information about Kenyan mineral deposits, what do you get?" He thought for a moment. "They promise continued investment. They say they'll expand operations. They claim more jobs will be created." I said, "Promises. They promise investment. They say they'll expand. They claim jobs will be created. But what do they commit to legally? What obligations do they accept contractually? What guarantees do they provide that can be enforced?" He was silent. I said, "They get valuable data. You get vague promises. They receive information that cost you money to compile. You receive commitments they can abandon any time. They obtain leverage they'll use to negotiate better terms. You surrender leverage you'll never recover. That's not partnership. That's exploitation with polite language." I said, "Now let me tell you what happens if you refuse. They'll threaten to withdraw. They'll warn about consequences. They'll predict economic disaster, and you'll be afraid. Genuinely afraid. Because those threats are designed to create fear." I said, "But here's what actually happens. They don't withdraw completely. They can't. Because Kenyan minerals are valuable. Because alternative companies will fill any gap they leave. Because their threats are mostly bluff designed to maintain advantages they're afraid of losing." I said, "Some will withdraw. Some will follow through on threats. Some will actually leave Kenya. Good, let them go. Because they're the companies that can only operate profitably if they maintain exploitative advantages. They're the partners who only invest if you accept unfair terms. They're the investors you don't want." I said, "Others will stay. Others will adapt. Others will accept your terms because Kenyan resources are valuable enough to justify fair partnership, and new partners will arrive. Partners willing to compete without demanding privileged information. Partners ready to invest on respectful terms. Partners who understand that sovereignty is non-negotiable." I said, "So yes, send them a map with no roads, or send them whatever symbolic gesture communicates that Kenyan data about Kenyan resources belongs to Kenya, and prepare for consequences. But understand that those consequences are temporary discomfort that leads to permanent sovereignty, while surrender is temporary comfort that leads to permanent exploitation." President Kenyatta sent Britain a map showing only the Great Rift Valley. No mineral deposits, No geological surveys, no resource locations, just the valley. The message: you can see our most prominent geographical feature. Our wealth is not your concern. Britain protested, threatened, warned, predicted, all the standard responses, and President Kenyatta stood firm, refused to surrender Kenyan geological data, insisted on competitive bidding without privileged information access, demanded that British companies compete on equal terms with everyone else. Some British companies withdrew, others stayed and adapted. New partners arrived from China, Turkey, India, UAE. Kenya's mineral sector continued developing, investment continued flowing. Jobs continued being created, but now on terms that respected Kenyan sovereignty and served Kenyan interests. That's a movement. That's a continental awakening. That's Africa controlling African information about African resources. That's sovereignty made real through collective action. They demanded access. We refused. They threatened punishment. We found alternatives. They assumed entitlement. We demonstrated sovereignty. And Africa is learning. Nation by nation, leader by leader, government by government. We're learning that we can say no. We're learning that alternatives exist. We're learning that sovereignty is achievable. We're learning that African resources, controlled by African nations, managed by African governments, developed on African terms, can build African prosperity. But we're learning something else too. Something more important than just resource control. We're learning that sovereignty is psychological before it's practical. That independence is mental before it's material. That freedom is internal before it's external. For generations, African leaders were taught that we needed Western approval, that we required Western investment, that we depended on Western partnership, that we couldn't survive without Western cooperation. That psychological conditioning was more powerful than any military force, more effective than any economic pressure, more controlling than any political manipulation. Because leaders who believe they need permission don't demand respect. Leaders who think they require approval don't assert sovereignty. Leaders who feel they depend on others don't control their own resources. The maps with no roads are breaking that psychological conditioning. Each map is an African leader telling themselves, I don't need their approval, I don't require their permission. I don't depend on their cooperation. I control my resources. I determine my terms. I assert my sovereignty. That internal transformation is what's changing Africa. Not just the policies, not just the negotiations, not just the partnerships, but the psychological shift from dependence to independence. From submission to sovereignty, from accepting exploitation to demanding respect. France demanded access to Burkina Faso's oil data. I gave them a map with no roads, and that map became a symbol, a continental symbol, a representation of African sovereignty, a statement that will echo across this continent for generations. Because we control our data, we manage our information, we determine access, we set terms, we choose partners, we build relationships, we develop resources, we benefit from wealth. We own our future. And no map they demand will show them more than we choose to reveal. No data they request will be provided unless we decide to share. No information they pressure us for will be surrendered just because they think they're entitled to it. We gave them a map with no roads, and that's all they'll ever get, unless they earn more, unless they compete fairly, unless they respect our sovereignty, unless they treat us as equals, unless they recognize that African resources belong to Africa. They demanded. We refused, and Africa is sovereign. Not aspirationally, not theoretically, not in some distant future, but actually, really, now, today, in practical decisions made by real leaders controlling real resources, serving real people. 14 nations have sent maps with no roads. 20 more are preparing similar gestures. 30 additional countries are considering joining this movement. The entire continent is awakening to the power of information control, to the leverage of data sovereignty, to the strength of collective refusal. This is how colonialism ends. Not with dramatic revolutions, not with violent confrontations, not with military victories, but with quiet refusals, with symbolic gestures, with leaders deciding that African information about African resources belongs to Africa and will be shared only on African terms. We gave them maps with no roads, and those maps are paving the road to genuine African sovereignty, real African independence, permanent African control of African resources, complete African benefit from African wealth. They demanded. We refused, and Africa is free. But let me tell you what freedom actually looks like. Because it's not abstract. It's not philosophical. It's not some distant aspiration. It's concrete. It's measurable. It's happening right now in ways that transform African lives every single day. Freedom looks like a Burkina Faso engineer working in our new battery factory instead of watching foreign technicians extract our cobalt. It looks like a Congolese geologist analyzing our own mineral surveys instead of handing that data to Belgian corporations. It looks like a Chadian oil worker operating sophisticated drilling equipment we now own instead of serving as cheap labor for French companies. Freedom looks like African children attending schools built with revenue from African resources. It looks like African hospitals equipped with technology purchased using African mineral wealth. It looks like African infrastructure constructed with capital generated from African oil and African gold and African diamonds. Freedom looks like African presidents making decisions without checking whether Western powers approve. It looks like African governments negotiating from strength instead of desperation. It looks like African nations choosing partners based on who serves our interests best, not based on who colonized us historically. This freedom wasn't given to us. We took it, we seized it, we claimed it, by saying no, by refusing demands, by sending maps with no roads. By demonstrating that sovereignty is not negotiable, not purchasable, not surrenderable. And this freedom is spreading. Every week, another African nation joins this movement. Every month, another government asserts control over geological data. Every year, more African resources develop under African terms serving African interests benefiting African people. The maps with no roads have become our declaration of independence. Not independence from trade, not independence from partnership, not independence from global engagement, but independence from exploitation, independence from submission, independence from accepting that African resources should enrich everyone except Africans. President Ramaphosa told me something profound last month. He said, "Brother Traoré, your map with no roads didn't just refuse France access to Burkina Faso data. It gave every African leader permission to refuse, permission we didn't know we needed but desperately required, permission to say no without guilt, permission to demand respect without apology, permission to assert sovereignty without fear." He said, "That's what your map really represents, not just information control, but psychological liberation, the freedom to believe that we have the right to control our resources, the confidence to know that we can survive their threats, the certainty that alternatives exist if we're brave enough to seek them. That psychological liberation is transforming Africa faster than any development program, faster than any aid package, faster than any foreign investment. Because leaders who believe they're sovereign act sovereign, nations that know they're free behave free, people who understand they control their destiny build their destiny. We gave them maps with no roads. Those maps became symbols. Those symbols became movements. Those movements became reality. That reality is African sovereignty, African independence, African freedom. They demanded our data. We refused. They threatened consequences. We accepted them. They predicted disaster. We created prosperity. They assumed we would fail. We proved them wrong. And now Africa is learning the most important lesson of all. We don't need their permission to be free. We don't require their approval to be sovereign. We don't depend on their cooperation to prosper. We just need the courage to say no, the strength to stand firm, the unity to support each other, the vision to build alternatives. We gave them maps with no roads, and in refusing to show them our resources, we found our own path, a path to sovereignty, a path to prosperity, a path to freedom, a path that belongs to us alone. They demanded. We refused. And Africa is free.